So what we are gonna talk about today is how can next level climate movements probably be a game changer for progress in climate protection. And so my name is Justus, and I'm the co-founder of the Future Matters project, which is a movement accelerator. Sometimes I kind of like explain to people it's like the Y Combinator for social movements. So we take promising social movements, at the moment only climate movements, and try to equip them with the essential skills of how to build momentum for change. And we might ask ourselves, like, why could that be important in the area of climate? And one question that I always like to ask myself when I approach a problem is, why haven't we solved this yet? Why does this problem even keep existing? And that's also something that we can ask ourselves for climate, right? Because it's just really, really important for like all of humanity. And there are all the obvious reasons of like free rider problems, coordination problems, the kind of like delay between like action and then event like climate change happening and so on. But I think if we look at the last 20 years or so, two things have also kind of changed. So I think our understanding of climate change has improved a lot. And I mean, even like 40 years ago, we were like certain about climate change, and there was actually not that much debate, but still in the way that we can show how bad it will be, I think that has also improved a lot in the last 20 years. And also there have been a lot of developments in green energy and so on. So I think where we are at is that we still need like several things to develop, new technologies and so on, but we do have the puzzle pieces to solve this problem. And then again, the question is like, why isn't it like a solved problem yet? And I would argue that this has to do a lot with barriers to change that we're facing and with a lack of building power for the solutions that we already have. And this is something that we can see for a lot of transformations and changes, that there are two sides to change. And one is policy supply, so the supply of solutions, and the other one is the creation of policy demand, so the demand for those solutions. And what we often have, and especially have in climate, is we have a lot of policy supply. So we have a lot of solutions. There's a lot of like reports showing us that we need to act, what we could do, and so on. But what we face is a political structure that is very much centered around short-term gains, that is very much built on like fossil fuel energy and so on. So it's very hard to just like implement any change that is conflicting with this current structure that we have in a lot of political systems. So what we probably need more is this demand for certain changes, the momentum that will then also lead to the implementation. And especially we just don't need only like general demand. So I think there's already a lot of people who agree that like climate is important. And there's also like a lot of politicians who think that we should do more, or a lot of businesses. But what's often needed also historically for breakthroughs is actually like momentum. So this kind of like moment where there's just so much support and so much pressure that all of a sudden certain decisions are made that weren't thought of being possible before. And that often has to do with preference falsification, for example. So a lot of people don't say what they really think, but just say what they think most other people think. And only if there's like a critical mass of people who like publicly state that they want a certain change, then they will join in. And so what we often see is like, if we can build up a certain momentum, we can also reach tipping points. So those cascades moments, and kind of like overnight, a certain policy area kind of like changes its course. And this is what we need, right? We need kind of like massive action, and we need rapid change. And when we look at a lot of cases historically, when this has happened, social movements were a crucial component of driving that change. So how can we build momentum? And there's one way that we could do that, and that's lobbying. But I think lobbying is a really, really important and crucial ingredient in this whole like transformation recipe. But the problem is like, why wasn't it possible yet to convince politicians just with like mere lobbying? And I think one important reason is that within the field of like classical lobbying, the like opponents in this like game have a strategic advantage, and those are fossil fuel industry, for example, who have like already like 30 years of experience and millions put into offices for like lobbying, have already built all those networks. So if you try to win a game in a field where like an opposing force has a strategic advantage, it will often be very hard to kind of like win that game. So where do we have like a playing field that is also very crucial for like politics and the like dynamics of like how systems evolve, but where those who support stronger climate protection have a strategic advantage. And I would argue that this field is popular support. If we look at like statistics from around the world, there's a vast majority in like most countries who's concerned about climate change, who wants their governments to take more action on this. And a lot of them are just like passive supporters at the moment. So there are people who would prefer that and who would be willing to also act upon that if enough other people would act upon that. But kind of like at the moment, probably aren't convinced enough to really take like grander action. So what can we do with that like strategic advantage to drive change? What other path is there to create policy demand? And we can take a brief digression into the inner mechanics of power. So let's take a look at like one concrete historical example of like how such a kind of like rapid change has worked. And that's the Otpor movement. So Otpor, Serbian, and means freedom. And so this was the Serbian freedom movement that overthrew the dictatorship in Serbia in just a few years. And they started with very few people and a very difficult situation, right? Kind of like trying to build a movement in a dictatorship. And what they did is they looked really closely on who is supporting the status quo and who is like an important column of support for keeping things as they are at the moment. And here's like a very valuable lesson that we can learn from that, which is if you want change, don't try to kind of like mobilize everyone, because there's hardly a movement where everyone joins, but look for the people where you say, okay, if we can win over these groups, if they would join, they are currently really close to the people who are blocking the change at the moment. And if they would change their mind, then we would have a completely different situation when it comes to majorities for certain decisions, for example. So Otpor did this analysis, and what they found in the case of Serbia was that actually police and military were the two forces that were stabilizing the status quo, the dictatorship in Serbia. And What they then did is they really tried to find out, like, in what ways do like police forces and military also suffer from the dictatorship as it was at that moment. Like, in what way are they dissatisfied with the status quo? And then they trained their supporters to also become really good in striking up conversations with like police and military, with actually what was more like the natural enemy of those movements, and kind of like talk about their worries, like the worries of like the police forces, the military, and so on, like in what way they were dissatisfied and so on. And they really worked hard to strategically win over those kind of like very unlikely but very valuable supporters. And so that's like a valuable lesson that we can learn. And here's also what I see as like a really great risk of like current climate movements, which is a lot of like popular climate movements that we have right now, not all, but some, do what most movements typically do, which is we have a big protest. How can we get as many people to the protest as possible? Let's try to mobilize all the people who think climate change is important, which is a great strategy if you want a big protest. But looking back on the example of Otpor, what we have just learned is that just a sheer number of supporters is probably not enough. But what really matters is who supports the change, and also social movements become successful if they change not only kind of like what the change is, so kind of like if they not only demand a certain change, but also if they change who supports that change. And so one typical mistake that I see is like focusing too much on like mobilizing an existing supporter base instead of looking like who's like hard to mobilize but would be very valuable if they would join, and then get better in what is called organizing, like an approach most well known from workers' unions, which is all about how can we find like certain problems within kind of like the grander change that we demand that is resonating with that group that we try to reach. You know, often like changing your mind and also changing what you publicly support for a certain topic is a very difficult and often vulnerable act. You know, you then have to explain to your like relatives and your friends why you don't think anymore what you said before that you think, and like, does that mean that you were wrong before, and so on. So often just like changing your mind about something, especially something like very profound, is very difficult for all of us. Also, like for people who are maybe at the moment more skeptical or hesitant about climate change, but also for us probably in other areas where we might have a blind spot. So if we like can in some way help climate movements become better at like identifying the groups who are kind of like the bottlenecks to change at the moment, who, if they would join a certain transformation, that would change majorities in a parliament, for example. Also, then we have like a greater chance to also really get that chance. And on the other hand, we have a lot of new people who are joining the fight for climate protection, and that's great. And I've also here, like in the work on climate community, I see like so many talented people who join. And at Future Matters Project, we've also worked with a lot of like new groups, kind of like managers for climate, or like church members, or people who haven't really engaged before in like social movements, but now want to do something. And as often very common in activism, people want to like act and do something, which is great because that's needed. But I think a second mistake that maybe a lot of like new movements can make is not really learning the kind of like necessary skills and building the necessary organizational foundation to create grander changes. So what do I mean with that? What I mean is not only to learn like, okay, what change do we need, but also how do we get that change? So understanding what the theory of change is and like how to link each step that you're doing to like the grander outcome that you're trying to achieve. Learning organizing, for example. So how to engage people into a new topic, how to make it easier for people to change their mind about a certain topic, and so on. So what we often encounter in our work is that people are like, we're like too busy to learn how to build power. Like there's so many things that we need to do right now. And often what happens with those movements, with these like new emerging movements, is that they then dissolve pretty fast. So investing in learning how to create change, I think is also really important. If we want to build a movement that can really drive change in the next 10 years. And I would argue that like, given like that the situation is so severe, we're actually running out of time for like just doing like short-term like direct wins. But we're actually at the point where we kind of like have to build the infrastructure and the like grander coalition to get like bigger changes. So movements aren't, of course, a magic fix, unsurprising, but what they can be and have been very often in history is a magnifier for everything else that is needed. So they can drive more investment into various areas, may that be like research, technological development, and so on. They can also make sure that the rules are set by politics that are needed to drive a certain change. So like, in short, they're often a catalyst for change. So what do we do at Future Matters Project to further catalyze the catalyst? What we do is we look into research and a lot of practical examples on how do movements become successful. Because although like movements that were very successful in various countries also have a lot of differences, they do have some common traits. For example, identifying who's a bottleneck to change at the moment and then strategically winning over that group. So like successful movements attract new support. And also we find a lot of like patterns in unsuccessful movements, like most movements that seem very promising, where there was like all this excitement that they will change the world, often were lacking a way to deal with internal conflict, and therefore they then often broke down. Or also they had like a vague idea of what they wanted, but they failed to then break that down into very tangible goals and create a clear plan to win. So what, like, how is every step that you do connected to the grander change that you try to achieve? So we look into all those examples, do a lot of like broader research and try to extract the like strategies and tools and principles that can help foster change. And what we then do is we see, okay, how can we get those success principles applied in existing climate movements that are really promising? And so what we do is we run experiments with like various formats of like implementation, dissemination, like training, coaching, and so on, and see like what combination of various dissemination formats is most likely to create change on a movement-wide level. What will change how the movement overall like works and builds support. And then as a third step, we build up structures within those movements. So people who can train new trainers and coaches who can coach new coaches and all that. So that at some point, these capacity building systems can grow and exist without us. So trying to make ourselves useless pretty fast, so we can move on to other movements and support them. So this is kind of like our approach to also support the climate movements and build that momentum that we need so much at the moment. And we have started 1.5 years ago. We're currently a team of 15 people, mostly working in Germany right at the moment where we started, and like several like other organizations looked into our work, and we're currently for like one major donor consultancy like rated as like one of the top climate organizations, which is pretty cool. And we also have like are privileged enough to often advise a lot of like movement leaders on like strategy and so on. So like really interesting and exciting work. I feel very grateful for that I can do that every day. And I hope I have been able to share like a tiny bit to like the very complex question of like how to like build more successful movements, and also like why social movements at all might be important. So just like a quick recap. We have seen that in order to get rapid change at the moment, we don't only need solutions, but we need massive momentum to get those solutions implemented very fast and widespread. And also another thing that I have tried to explain is in what way building social movements can help us make use of the strategic advantage that climate protection has, that is having a lot of popular support that isn't activated yet, while fossil fuel industry, for example, doesn't have that. So we can make use of that, and we can best make use of that if we identify the groups who are currently blocking the change and trying to find the people within those groups who are already supporting the change that we want to see, and then enable them in winning over also these groups, so that like this change that we want to see just becomes in some way the social norm, and just like what normal people think and what normal people want. And we can do so by like looking out and like what's the next group that we can help join our movement, and also by building good team structures, good decision structures, ways to deal with conflict, and so on, and learn how to be persuasive in our communication, how to help people change their minds, and so on, and by that way, catalyzing the change that we urgently need in climate. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Justus. So for the Q&A, we're a pretty close group right now. Well, why don't we just let people unmute themselves? If you have a question, you can ask it. And if that gets too hectic, then we'll come up with a more structured approach. And maybe I can kick things off, actually. What you said about the Otpor movement made me think a lot about the 3.5% rule. And I think Dorothy mentioned something in the chat about that. I want to know if you're familiar with Erica Chenoweth and the 3.5% rule, and if so, what your thoughts are of it.
Thank you for that question. I think it's actually one of those examples, I would argue, of kind of like movement science being like poorly transferred into the real world. So if we look on like, so where does this...
Maybe just for everyone, can we start with like a quick summary of what it is?
Sure, sorry, yeah. So there is this claim of one researcher that if you activate like, or if 3.5% of a population engage in a movement, then historically always there has been like the movement got what they demanded. So that's the claim. At least the claim how it was then kind of like more broadly communicated. But if we actually look into that research, we see this research has been done in a very specific context, which at the start were mostly like Asian dictatorships, and then also movements that were dealing with very direct oppression. So for example, the civil rights movement in the US. Given that context, I think it's like very much kind of like in doubt whether this kind of like really extrapolates as like a rule. So like if you get so many people involved, then you will always get the change. For a change that is really different. So like most of the climate movements that we have at the moment are in democracies, and it's also something where it's less about direct oppression, but rather about like fear about like future scenarios and so on. So I would say like 3.5% of the population aren't like enough as like a general kind of like threshold after which you will get change. But I think rather like pay attention, like can you get people from all over society to really engage in a certain fight. So if we like take the example of the US, and if there's like certain like climate laws which are maybe like, let's say, blocked by the Republicans, and you get like 3.5% of the population who are all like very kind of like loyal Democratic voters, who then try to threaten the Republican Party that they should like change their kind of like stance on this law. This will be like a very hard kind of like bargain. Like we never voted for you, and we will not continue voting for you if you don't change your stance on this topic. It would be very different if it's like a swing state, for example, where a few percentage in voters could make the difference in whether or not a certain governor gets elected. And then there's like an alliance of like Republican voters who say like, we would vote, although we do not really feel like super comfortable about it, we would vote for the Democrats for the first time, if not also the Republican Party will support this policy, for example. Then you have something like, then you can bargain with something, then there's like a real threat.
Awesome, thanks. Arjun, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Oh, so thanks, Justus. I think that was super interesting. I really like the idea that you had about, the concept that you mentioned about finding sort of the strategic group within that swing group and sort of using them to sort of move the needle. And it sort of reminds me of a lot of the work that I used to do in the past in terms of political campaigning. But my question is in this scheme of things, when you're sort of trying to win this swing group over, and especially like in the context of climate change, when we think how important it is, from your experience, how do you see that you don't compromise on certain aspects of the movement while still winning over that group? Because what I've seen is that what tends to happen is that you do have to sort of find some common ground, or you have to make some sort of, you basically have to make some compromises somewhere. So how do you sort of navigate that without losing the essence or the purity of the movement in itself?
Yeah. So I think what's really important there is within that group that you try to win, find the people who already support the change you want. So the people where you don't have to compromise that much with. And they were often like rare. There may be not that many people, but like in almost all groups of society, you can always find a few people who say like, yeah, most of my peers think this should happen, but I actually think like that would be the right thing to do. And this is already like the change that you're demanding. So find those people, among those people, find the like people who have a very good network. So people that other people usually turn to get like advice or to just like chat with and so on. So find the people who have a good network, who already support your change, and who also to some degree are good communicators already. And it's hard to find those people, but like with like a bit of effort, if you kind of like design certain offers for people that like lead to strong self-identification. So if you say like only the person who we're really looking for, who we would try to identify would kind of like be excited about this, then you sometimes can find those people. We've done that with like Catholic voters that are in the countryside in Germany, for example. So like a population that it's like rarely kind of like super excited about like climate policy, and then train those people, equip those people with the tools that they need to convince their peers. And I think one important principle there is like the messenger matters much more than the message. So if you have those people who are like part of the in-group who then try to convince those others, there might be less need for compromise compared to if you directly approach people who kind of supportive but skeptical. So find the ambassadors within that group, train them to become like then organizers within that group. And once they have like built a little following, then kind of like directly interact with like the group and not just the ambassadors. That would be like one strategy that has worked for us in our work.
Interesting, thank you. Nobody has another question. I did have another sort of follow-up question, but I want to give somebody else the space to speak in case they don't.
Sure. I just had a small question, if that's okay, which is more, as you engage with different organizations and look at how you worked with existing organizations, thinking about how they reach populations, how they grow sustainably, like, is there models that you've seen work differently in different countries, whether in Germany or in the US and other places, for climate organizations to build and grow and sustain energy in their organizations? Because I think one thing I've seen with different movements is that they ebb and flow in energy, and like sort of, you have a year or two of like highly motivated, driven folks, and then they kind of hit burnout quickly. And so the sustenance is something that I've seen as a question that's popped up quite often.
Yeah, true. Which I think is actually one of the like great problems of movement, that there's like this movement failure cycle where after 2 years, a lot of movements fail. And that's often because they lose their kind of like most capable supporters due to burnout, which is like another example of like how short-term kind of like action and thinking can be like very hurtful for movements. And I think there's like various ways that you can at least reduce that risk. And one is how can you build up people who can take over part of the like work that like current leaders are doing, and how can you make that like a common process within that movement? So what we always try to suggest to like movements is like, for every kind of like important role within your local group, for example, have at least a second person who for some time is just like a kind of like silent, kind of like background shadower who's just like participating in this work, watching the people who are already capable at that, also getting like a bit like trained and mentored by them and so on, that for like every crucial position, there are at least 2, better 3 people within like a small group of people, so that we don't end up in these situations of like, if I don't do it, then the whole thing breaks down, because that's often what leads people into burnout. Then I think often a second approach is just like making sure that like groups split as soon as they get like too big. Because once they get like too big, then often it becomes like really hard to like organize. You spend a lot of time and like calls discussing what you should do instead of like doing things, which then can become like very frustrating. So if that's like a city, then say like, and you do some like campaigning or organizing work, then try to like either differentiate by like what part of the campaign is done by which group. So who's doing like the door-to-door campaigning, who's doing like the media part, or like split by like various parts of a town or so, so that basically everyone can still know each other, trust each other, and also coordination costs are lower. And then like a third thing that is really important is like grow on the fringes. So what often happens with movements is they become very like inward focused. So there's like a number of like cool leaders or so, and everyone tries to get like closer to the leaders. And so like the thing that gets rewarded within that movement is kind of like going more inward, getting closer to the leaders. And what then often happens is like if people are concentrated on that, inflow from like the like general population starts to decrease. And of course, people will also leave that movement at some point. And if they aren't replaced by new people, because no one is like recruiting the new people, then naturally the supporters who are still there also have to take over their job. Then it gets like more stressful, more demanding, more frustrating. People burn out and so on, then you have that vicious cycle. So like the coolest thing that new people can do if they join a movement is bring two friends and tell those friends to also bring two friends. Because also if you're just new to a movement, you're still speaking kind of like the language of like most other people like in the population. You haven't become like too much part of that like activism group, which then also has all these like special terms and sometimes can seem like a bit weird if you're not part of the movement yet. So like the best thing people can do is bringing in new people, giving them like good things to work on. And like if you join a movement, first thing that like should be encouraged is just like bring two friends. So that you have people in the group you already know, and the group just like keeps growing also after like a longer time, when like the original members maybe don't have the drive to just like keep building like the whole movement.
Dorothy.
Thanks, Sam. Justus, I love what you're just talking about. The most important thing you can do is bring in two friends. And I also have to point out that we seem to be doing a very successful job at what we're up to, which is sort of the antithesis of what you're up to. And between the two of us together and our organizations, maybe we really will get somewhere. Because after my 45 or 50 years working in the climate movement, instead of trying to find those outliers, what we're doing is working only with those people that are already very interested in climate change, but helping them come together in teams and really create their own personal climate action plans for 2030, reducing their carbon footprint by 50%. And so people come together in clusters of groups and talk to one another and make these plans. And part of their assignment is two things. One is to go out and talk about it every week, and also is to bring in other people. But it's the opposite of what you're talking about, because we're not trying to motivate those new people that are not yet part of the movement. We're saying, my God, we are in a crisis right this very second. And if we don't bring our carbon footprint down right now, we don't have 8 years to bring it down. We need to bring it down now. If we wait for the 8 years for that to happen, as all these long chain things can be, but we need to have this happen immediately. And so if we take those people and we look at another model of how change happens, 13.5% of the population is considered early adapters in most topics. And those 13.5% convince the other people, the early majority, to take on the ways of the early adopters. And that changes policy, that changes business, that changes everything. So most of the people that come to our groups they have taken for starters. And many of these are people who say, I don't have anything to learn. I'm an environmentalist. I'm already there. And they come to this and they are shocked at what their carbon footprint is right now. We're using the Earth Overshoot Day, and most of them are in the March category. And by the end of these suggestions, when they project out, they're in the June category, which is phenomenal. That's double their, or half, I should say, the carbon footprint. I'm very pleased with your work, and I'm happy that you'll work on that side of people who are not yet convinced. And I'd like to let you know that there also is success on working people who can be on board, but we can be on board much more fully if we come together in these teams. Our project is called the Carbon Crew Project, which Sam knows a little bit about. Thank you, Sam, for spreading the word. Appreciate it.
I was very happy to have heard all this insight, and thank you for sharing it from the studies that you've done and the work you've done elsewhere. My question was, since you have been exposed to the Slack community as it is currently, work on climate, is there anything that comes to mind in terms of what could be changed, the potential it holds, and what it could do for us as compared to, for example, the Serbian movement? Thank you.
Thank you. Such a good question. I have to admit that recently I haven't been too engaged with the work on climate community. So I don't have like a really good and exact overview at the moment of what the community is doing. But I think what I really like about this community, and what I think is like a strength that probably it should keep on building, is the community building around like certain areas or topics and so on, because people join for a cause and they stay for the people. It's very hard to keep working on something and keep being motivated if like everything you do is only around like achieving a change, which is often so and painful. So if you don't have like other people that you also know besides kind of like your engagement in climate, where you also know that you both like to do drawing, sketching, that you have things in common that you share, that there are people that you look forward to meet again, then I think it's very hard to also create like long-lasting engagement. So I don't know how much of that like personal exchange and often also just like fun is like the focus of like work on climate. But this is like one advice that I often give is like, if you want people who give like a lot of hours and who stay for a lot of years, make sure that like they also know each other as humans and not just as people supporting a certain cause.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then if we were to pull a quick parallel between the policemen and the people that are nearly convinced and identify those to today's world where we can identify businesses, for example, that are polluting, is that something that could be further expanded by the work on climate community, where we approach those businesses and sort of represent or try to tickle their issues, like you said, to get them to see the light, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, also when it comes, for example, to targeting businesses, I think what's often really good is asking yourself, what role could that business play again then in a larger change on the policy level? Because often there's like certain incentives within a like economic system also, which is you can make more profit if you like build your business in a way that is very kind of like carbon unfriendly, for example. And so if you get like a business to change that and to act against the incentives of like the overall economic system, what has happened often in the past, for example, with animal welfare, is that there was just like a regression to like the incentive after some time. And so what you can do with businesses is say like, okay, we try to get this business to implement a certain policy, but then we also in that process try to make sure that like this business starts lobbying with all their resources for that to become a general law. So like the playing field is like on the same level again for all competitors. Also, so how can you like use individual actors as like leverage points to then change the like long-term overall rules that everyone has to abide to?
Well, yeah, those nuances and complexities are very much welcome. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Arjun, I see you have your hand up again.
Yeah, I do. It's a fascinating discussion. So I have many questions. But anyway, just as one quick thing, since you've been working like in this field at scale, and I'm sure a lot of the work that you mentioned, I mean, it's a lot of like stakeholder mapping and things like that. Any interesting tools or resources, like software based or whatever, that you could point us towards that could help us in our own respective whatever it is that we're trying to achieve?
Okay, let me think. What I can do is send a follow-up maybe on Monday, because it's already like late evening here, or like not late evening, but evening. And think about that question, because I assume I will have like better answers to that if I can take like 5 minutes brainstorming about this, rather than just like answering it right now. When it comes to software, unfortunately, I don't know of like any software that I could like definitely recommend for that. But if you do know one, I would be really eager to hear about that and learn about that.
No, sure. Please take your time and whatever comes to mind, I'd be happy to hear, because it seems like you have great input. So I'll be willing to wait for that.
Arjun, I missed that. You were looking for software for what?
So, a lot of what he was talking about in terms of how you map out these different groups and these different stakeholders, and how you sort of could keep track of that, because I think like one of the things that becomes sort of very unwieldy is how you are able to sort of keep track of the progress, as well as also see where you failed and make adjustments and tweaks. And so I thought maybe we could, Justus, even if it's not software, even if it's like a methodology that you can think, I mean, you don't have to give it to me right now, but on Monday or whenever next week. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like in general, like what we use a lot are just like the common kind of like tools and approaches of like lean service development, where you just try to find like various groups, and you just who like share certain similarities, and then you just do like various kind of like modes of dissemination, like training, coaching, and so on. And then you will just like see, okay, how many people sign up, or even before that, like building the minimum viable product. So just creating like an expression of interest form, for example, for like 20 different kind of like kinds of events, and then just seeing like, where do people sign up very quickly and where do a lot of people sign up, and then starting to build the kind of like minimum version of the things where there was like a lot of expression of interest, then just like seeing, do like what we focus a lot on is like behavior change and behavior activation. So if we tell someone, okay, here's how to make a better campaign plan, 3 weeks later, has that person made a campaign plan based on that? And if so, what led to this? Or if not, like what were the barriers stopping that person from doing this, and so on? Because like as often, like all the kind of like knowledge that you have and all the tactics and strategies are only as good as how much they are executed in the right way. So these are often like the kind of like, I think, very simple ways in how to kind of like figure out like what to do, and then just like have, so we often just like have like Google Forms where people sign up for like the like trainers that we have trained, and so we can just like track how many participations we have, and then there's like feedback forms later on what people can do, and then we can like just track behavior changes on like a nationwide level. Or these are like the very like simple Google Forms and Google spreadsheets approaches that we use in our work.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think if you keep it simple, sometimes it's just the best tactic. Thanks for that.
Awesome. We might have time for one more quick question. If no one has one, I can jump in with one as well.
I have a funny one, which is more like, I think it's like, there's one of your slides was like, don't just succumb to just going to people who are already like fans of you to try and talk to them and engage them and try and grow your movement. So that comes with this question of like, when you say you want to go broad, you're now like, your 5% of the people who love you already will come to everything you organize. And then you have like this 80% who are kind of apathetic. And then you have, call it like, 5 or 10% who are like completely abhorrent to your ideas. And so carving out that 80% and getting more specific on who's potentially adjacent to things you care about, things you need, and how you grow movements has been something that like historically has been super hard for a lot of groups to identify.
Yeah.
Like what part of the middle population to go after. And it's basically like a traditional ad tech problem, right? Like, who loves your products, but finding the median people and getting them to like buy your product is really hard. And that's where most marketing money is wasted. And similarly, most like outreach money is wasted. So like, I don't think there's any single silver bullet, but like, is there anything that you've noticed climate movements do better or worse from the groups you worked with in the past?
Yeah, I think one thing that's just so crucial is just give people a very good reason to participate and make this as valuable as possible. So like the first question is, do you want everyone at the group meeting like every week? Probably this is like not necessary for creating the change that you want, and it's also unrealistic. So like most people will not be like permanent part of the movement, but they will just participate in a few moments where they think like, if I do something now, this will make a difference. And so I think having that ask very clear, in Germany, in our work, there was, for example, look at like the climate policies of various parties, and then vote for the party that you resonate with, that has like the best climate policy. And what we try to do there is kind of like create this competition between parties on like who has the even stronger climate protection offer to their voters. So we figured like if we could get like a small percentage of like atypical supporters of the climate movement to then also express in kind of like those polls before that they would like change who they vote for, we would probably get in this like cascade dynamic of like parties competing on like having the strictest and the strongest climate policy offer. And if you can show people like, if you and like a few other people, like a lot of other people, but probably like not everyone, but like a number that seems like realistic would engage in this could probably change like how like climate politics will evolve in the next years. If you find such kind of like crucial moments and then can make like a really good offer to those people, then I think you can get them engaged for like simple actions that make it a great difference.
All right, well, thank you so much, Justus. I think we're pretty much at time, so do you have any last words for us?
Okay, so thank you all so much for your time. I have like actually a last few words, which are about, so we do hopefully a lot of like important and valuable work, but we're actually 4 months away from like running out of funding, which is not a great situation to be in, as you can imagine. But we do have like a Friends Fund also in the US, so we can accept tax deductibility donations from the US. If you happen to know someone who would be like super excited about like very evidence-based movement building, as we have described that today, then probably forward them like this kind of like website, or also like forward that email and have them reach out. And apart from that, thank you all so much for your work that you're doing. Thank you for engaging in the Work on Climate community. And I hope you all have a good day.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Justus. And we do have a time-honored tradition of sharing one thing we learned from the meeting with the community. And so I'm going to create a thread in the events official channel after this. And if anyone has something in particular they took away from the event and something that'll like maybe spark a discussion or spark someone else to watch the recording, then it would be great to share that with everyone. And yeah, thank you so much, Justus, and thank you everyone for attending.